So what I want to talk about today is the difference between passive range of motion, aka flexibility, and active range of motion, aka mobility. The key difference here is motor control of these ranges of motion. I don't care if you can get to 180 degrees of motion passively. If you can't actively trust yourself in that range, we might find issues. So with this graph, let's talk about a specific example, maybe ankle dorsiflexion. Let's say an individual has a passive range of motion, need a wall test, or the clinician can take their ankle through maybe 50 degrees of passive range of motion. Perfect. But what if we ask the same individual to actively go through this range of motion, engaging tib anterior and their active dorsiflexors, and they're only able to get through maybe 30 degrees of range of motion? This might be a discrepancy of range of motion, lacking motor control, where we might find issues. So to illustrate this, let's input force somewhere along this graph. If I put force in, F for force, in above someone's passive range of motion capacity, what do we see? Issues. We see sprains, strains, and potentially tears. I mean, imagine if my knee is fully extended and somebody kicks you in your knee. You're going to hyperextend and thus strain, sprain, tear some sort of tissue in there. So I like drawing a little sad face in there. We're not happy if we input force above our passive range of motion. All right, so what happens if we input force in between these two? If I input force between my active range of motion and my passive range of motion, I don't have a sprain or strain that's terrible, but I'm definitely not happy. This is generally where people have a spasm, especially a protective muscular spasm, shortening spasm, and come seek providers like me. Lastly, if we input force anywhere below our active range of motion, our ability to control this range of motion, this is where we see athleticism or happiness. No sprain, strains, no injuries, no problems whatsoever. So I think our goal should be to get this active range of motion increased towards our passive range of motion. Thus, we are decreasing the discrepancy between 50 degrees to 30 degrees. So let's say, for example, we get this individual to control all the way up to 45 degrees of range of motion. Now there's only a 5-degree discrepancy where we might be meh, and then if we're past that, we're just torn. But we have a much bigger range of active athletic range of motion. So I know we just created a mess here on the whiteboard, but hopefully this explains the difference, which is major, between flexibility and mobility. The difference between our capacity and our ability, and how motor control is the missing link between these two.